Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'm a little late, but I wanted to get my review for the movie Oppenheimer out there, as it was one of my most anticipated movies for the year. So let's get ready to jump in and talk about Christopher Nolan's latest epic, Oppenheimer. As I just mentioned, Oppenheimer was one of my most anticipated movies for this year. I'm a huge Nolan fan. I'd probably say he's my favorite director, at least working today, and definitely contending for all time. So I was very highly anticipating this movie, especially because it seemed something different from his typical filmography. He's kind of not necessarily spread his wings, but he's kind of dipped his toe into other ponds every once in a while. He hasn't done it to this extent, I think, in a little while. We kind of got a little bit of it with Dunkirk, of something a little bit different from him. But then we have looking more back on his filmography, like Memento, Following, Prestige, a little bit more like different than unique. And I think this is definitely showcasing going back to those roots of something really interesting and really unique, and doing it in such a grounded and interesting way based off of historical events. So while this is so different from his previous works, I think there is a level of familiarity with it at the same time, as it's very much a culmination of everything that he's done before in his previous films, just on display, and it's a marvel to experience. Starting things off with the story, I think the story is probably its strongest asset. I think it's a really interesting, really compelling story. Getting to follow along with Robert J. Oppenheimer, along with his a lot of his life, really. We get to follow along with, I think, about 30 years or so of his life in U.S. history, as he and a team of scientists worked to develop the atomic bomb that was used in World War II. And I think it's an incredibly fascinating story, and getting to see all of it, for the most part, from his direct point of view, is really interesting, and it makes it even more compelling of a story. As you're getting inside of his head, you really get an opportunity to see the way that he views the world and the work that he's doing. And I think it's something that Christopher Nolan is probably the only one who's capable of doing in such a way that they did in this movie. Now, besides his story, there are a ton of other characters in this movie, so many more than I could even name just to summarize. But looking specifically at one of the more main prominent characters, we also have Robert Downey Jr.'s character. I think he's fantastic. It's so cool to see him doing something besides Marvel stuff. I've loved him in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's great to see him doing really great performances again in movies like this. And I think his story, kind of being the antagonist of the film with Oppenheimer, is really great, and he gives a fantastic performance. It's really impressive that this story can be on the scope that it is, with the amount of characters that it has. You know, there's a few main characters, but there are a lot of secondary characters as well, but they each kind of get their moment to shine, and a lot of them are done by really great, fantastic actors that are really cool to see them pop up for either a cameo for one scene, or like Matt Damon's character pops up for about half the movie or so. So it's really cool to see all of the different kind of interweaving characters throughout this story. Like I said, none of them feels like a wasted opportunity. Each one has a very intentional and deliberate purpose and meaning for the scenes that they're in, if they are a smaller role, or if they are introduced later in the story, or if they're only earlier in the film, they have a significance, and so they're very meaningful to the story that is being told. Like I said, as we are following along more directly with Oppenheimer and his arc and story. Now, I already talked about Robert Downey Jr.'s performance a little bit, but I think Cillian Murphy, it's so great to finally see him in a leading role, and kind of the clout that has come with that, of finally having the opportunity to really, in a big way, show the masses what he's capable of doing. I've been a really big fan of his for a long time. I can't even remember the first movie of his that I saw, but I've been a fan of his in Peaky Blinders. I always thought his smaller roles in Christopher Nolan movies were really great, and then some other stuff as well. So he's just been someone who I've considered to be one of the most underrated actors working today, and it's so great to finally see him in that spotlight and really get to showcase what he's capable of doing from a performance point of view. Like many of the secondary characters I've mentioned, people like Florence Pugh, Emily Blunt, Matt Damon, and many others that I can't even remember off the top of my head, they're great. So especially the ones that I mentioned give really good performances. Emily Blunt, what a fantastic supporting role. I would have actually liked to seen more of her in the story, but I think the usage of her character was really great, and you can tell she really put a lot into building that character for the screen, for all of the complications that she has to deal with. And same with Florence Pugh's character. She's only in a portion of the story, but the portion that she's in is fantastic, and she just constantly impresses me with her acting ability. I've been a fan of hers since Outlaw King, I think, on Netflix. That was the first time I saw her, and I will watch pretty much anything she does. I think she's absolutely great. Now moving on to the filmmaking. Now this is where Christopher Nolan gets to show off and really show us what he's continues to learn and develop and advance with IMAX technology. I did not have the opportunity to see the movie in true IMAX. It's just too far and inconvenient for me to be able to travel to a legitimate IMAX theater to see it, but I did get to see it in a normal traditional theater. I think it was an AMC that we went to, and it was a really great experience nonetheless. Despite missing out on that 70 millimeter film experience, we really enjoyed it. I was really blown away by the color palette of the film, specifically the color versus the black and white. And I think it was such an interesting and effective decision to do that, because we get to follow along with Oppenheimer directly in these color scenes, but then we get these moments in black and white where we kind of step outside of that point of view and get to see what it's like for other characters looking in on him, whether it be for the good or bad intentions that they have. So I think that was a brilliant decision for the film itself, and I think it'll be something that we'll probably see in more films going forward, because traditionally, black and white is used for like a flashback type sequence in color for present time. But I think it's really cool to take it and make it more of a subjective versus an objective point of view. So I love the way that Nolan used that for the film. Next, moving on to another aspect of the filmmaking, the music and the sound. Before I blab on about the music, the sound is incredible. Like I said, I wasn't in a super fancy theater, just a normal theater, but it still sounded absolutely great. The dialogue was really good, I think. I know some people complain about Nolan and how he records dialogue. I didn't have issues hearing anything. I thought the dialogue was really good. The sound effects were all really good when we get to the Trinity test or many of the other experiments that they're going through. All of it sounds fantastic. And like I said, there's these moments where we kind of step into the mind of Oppenheimer and how he visually views the world. And those moments, the flashes of lights and sounds combined together, really, I feel like give you a better understanding of his character, his brain, his understanding of the world and how he sees it. So I think sound for that was really on point. And then, like I said, I'm going to blab on about this music for a while. I'm obsessed with this soundtrack. I've probably listened to it at least a dozen times since seeing the movie. I think it is some of the best work of Ludwig Göransson. He is right up there with Hans Zimmer and John Williams for me as my favorite composers. I love the violin focus of this soundtrack. The violin is one of my favorite orchestra instruments to listen to, and the creativity that they have within this movie with that instrument and the other instruments that they utilize is just mind-blowing. Even when we were only minutes into the movie, when we finished the first scene where everything's kind of started to set up and we get to look at the world through Oppenheimer's eyes for the first time, the music cuts out after that first song. I leaned over to my brother and was like, this music's incredible already. So the music is just mind-blowing. I was constantly enthralled with the addition that it made to the movie. It really adds a lot more emotion. It adds to the stakes, and it's just incredibly creative as well. I can't believe we got two fantastic soundtracks in a row from Göransson of Tenet and now Oppenheimer. I think him and Zimmer are going to be the frequent back and forth for Nolan of who he's going to bring on for his movies for music. And I will not be upset about that, because they're two of my favorite composers, and I love pretty much everything these guys put out. Next, moving on to the themes of this movie. There's a lot of really interesting things that this movie addresses. At a nearly 3-hour runtime, there's all these different characters, like I said, but we get to understand what weight it must have been for someone like Oppenheimer to deal with what he had done and what he had created. And I think this movie showcases brilliantly what kind of an effect that would have on him. And once we finally get to see something like the Trinity test, and then him afterwards, and just how tore up he is about it because he's so proud of his creation, but at the same time hates himself for it, I think. And it's so well presented through the film. And I think whether it's the visual cues that they give, I won't spoil anything for it, but like the things that he sees when he's dealing with these emotions and these thoughts, and there's such good imagery to go along with it, with the horrors of what he has created and how terrifying it can be, really. I think a theme of the truth is very prominent in the movie as well. For much of it, he is being deposed, I think is the word, in this, not necessarily court, but is similar to a court type thing, about what he did and how they created the atom bomb and his background, his history, how it affected him, the decisions he made before, during, and after, all that kind of stuff. And just a theme of truthfulness really was prominent throughout that. And he's just doing his absolute best to be truthful and honest, whether it's good or bad, of the things he has done, and how the world would interpret something like that, and how it is presented to maybe skew in certain directions. So I think thematically, the movie was very powerful. Everything about this movie is firing on all cylinders, whether it's the performances, the filmmaking, the music, the sound, the visuals, the cinematography, all of it. It's just masterclass of Christopher Nolan. Like I said, culminating everything he has done and everything he's learned up until this point. I can't wait to see what he will do next. Very quickly, before we wrap everything up, I do want to go through a couple of minor criticisms. I don't think this movie is perfect. I think it is pretty darn close, especially in certain instances, but I do have a few minor criticisms. I think, like I said, no character or cameo is wasted in this movie, but at the same time, there's some things I might have liked a little bit more of, or some things a little bit less of, whether it's some dialogue sequences, just small stuff like that. I'm literally nitpicking at this point. So there's a few moments that I think a couple of characters, it would have been cool to see a little bit more from them as far as like background or personality, that kind of thing. But like I said, very minor stuff. Besides that, the only real issue I had with the movie was the nudity that they included. I think we could have done those sequences without necessarily showing the graphic nature of it. There's a lot of creative ways to imply that kind of stuff without outright showing it, but that's more of my personal preference. So like I said, aside from some nitpicky stuff and some personal preference stuff, this movie is nearly perfect. I can't believe how great of a track record Nolan has on his filmography, and I can't wait to see what we get next from him. So in the end, I gave Oppenheimer a 4.5 out of 5 stars in review. I would love to hear in the comments below what you thought of the movie, your rating, score, review, that kind of thing, what you liked, what you didn't like. I would love to have you join in the conversation. So thank you for checking out this video. Thank you for sticking around to the end. I will see you in the next one.